So I recently defended my PhD thesis, and while it's customary for your supervisor to give you a gift, I figured I would spice things up and create a sort of personalized memento to kind of commemorate the occasion. So for a little bit of context, I completed my PhD at the Department of Medical Biophysics with a special focus on multiplexed imaging. And one of the drugs, or rather molecules, that we use frequently in a lot of hypoxia-related imaging is a 2-nitroimidazole called pimonidazole. This is a drug that will bind irreversibly to regions of hypoxia. Initially, it was explored as sort of a hypoxic cell radiosensitizer, but now it's garnered more use as a potential target for imaging. Because it binds irreversibly to regions of low oxygen, we can stain for it and image regions of hypoxia within tissue sections. So I wanted to figure out a way of essentially incorporating aspects of pimonidazole into some sort of personalized memento. Now, of course, you can't buy, 3D printed molecules of this anywhere. You can't really find a lot about this drug because how niche and specialized it is. So you're not going to find a lot of vendors who can actually sell, custom gifts using this molecule as sort of a central theme. And also, I kind of wanted to just explore the capabilities of various molecular rendering programs to see if I could, put two and two together and create some nice, gift, maybe a paperweight or something to put on desks. So on that note, let's kind of get started with the workflow. So the first thing I did was I made, a standard looking platform, and I imported the molecule of pimonidazole. I also added a little bit of text to the plaque, saying, Waters Korzinski Lab 2024. But the real challenge was actually designing this molecule. How do you go from, a chemical formula for pimonidazole to a three-dimensional STL file, which has been rendered with, reasonable approximations for bond geometries. So there's a variety of tools, but the first starting point is using PubChem to download and preview the molecule. So you can download the structure based on its chemical entry. I don't know if it's mentioned here, but usually they have a unique well, I guess this is probably the unique name. But from this, we can load it into a program like Avogadro. And what Avogadro will do is it allows you to kind of play around with bond geometries, add or remove functional groups. Here, what I wanted to do was to optimize the bond geometries to account for the fact that different atoms have different electronegativities and different bonds can control whether or not a molecule can rotate around those bonds. Something like an sp3 hybridized atom, like I want to say maybe this carbon over here, is going to be relatively rigid compared to something like this, which only has single bonds attached to it. So in Avogadro, you can do something like optimize geometries, and as you can see in real time, it computes electronegativities, bond strains, all those things, to create a more realistic depiction of this molecule. Next up, we can use something like Pymol, which will allow us to load this and confirm it's correctly being rendered, choose the size of the hydrogen atoms, the size of the different carbon atoms, oxygen, nitrogen, bond lengths, bond scales, if we wanted to scale the atoms relative to their electronegativity. And most importantly, be able to export this as an STL file. So once that was loaded as an STL file, well, where did it go? Well, I believe the animation is still running. My bad. Let's see if we can quickly cancel this. If not, I'll continue to discuss some of the design considerations, at least within Cura. So once this is finished loading, we can jump back and describe, why is it taking so long to render? What were the main bottlenecks? and what were some caveats and considerations that future work could take into account such that it's a lot easier to design and implement. There we go. So let's start off with the less important pieces first. The base plate. This was, I believe, a 5 millimeter tall piece, and you can see that the edges over here are chamfered. Is that the correct term? Filleted, sorry. Filleted. And the reason we fillet edges is for two reasons. One is that it makes it easier to remove from the build plate, because we can sort of wedge something in here to peel it off the build plate. Another reason is smoothness. No one likes, cutting themselves on sharp corners, especially if this is meant to be a gift. So filleting the edges was a reasonable design consideration that can be applied to virtually any sharp corner. I didn't apply this to the molecule because I didn't need to. There were no sharp corners in this molecule other than cylinders that lead into spheres, neither of which really have sharp corners. What they do have, however, are high poly counts, because if you're trying to approximate something that is uniformly smooth or circular or spherical or cylindrical, ultimately this boils down to a collection of triangles. So exporting it from PyMol will have, fairly high poly counts because this was never the intent of the software. But in Fusion 360, you can remesh, Remesh, to reduce the number of polygon counts. Now, of course, this is going to make it seem more like a low poly model. The triangles are going to be more pronounced when rendered. But you have to keep in mind, this is going to be 3D printed, and if you have a 3D printer with a vertical resolution of only 0.2 millimeters, reducing poly counts really won't make that big of a difference. In fact, I could have even reduced it more than that, but I've got a 32-thread PC, so not that computationally intensive. What you also want to do is, what's it called? Bandage? Fix? Repair. So on occasion, PyMol has been known to generate meshes with sort of incomplete geometries, and this repair tool will allow you to fix it, such that when you convert it to a solid object, so say convert to mesh, it will be solid, it will have a solid inside. The other issue I've had when trying to print molecules is poor adhesion to supports. And rather than having your 3D printing software govern the creation of these supports, I decided to add a few permanent ones. Not too many, such that it would take away from the aesthetics, but what I did was I simply looked at the top, figured out some core carbons to anchor, drew circles underneath them, and then of those circles, I chose 4 to kind of choose which ones I want to insert manual supports onto. So that kind of covers how the molecule was designed. Let's go to the text. Now this text can be constructed using whatever font size, whatever font style, bold, italics, to fit your needs. But from what I've read, the Arial font size seems to work well for 3D printing, so we decided to go with that. Generally speaking, fonts with smoother edges, I believe it's called serif fonts, are a little easier to 3D print because 3D printers never really work very well with sharp corners. So that would be one design consideration for future designs, is to use a font that has more rounded edges. Of course, I could do the same laying step, not only on the base itself, but the font. But again, I didn't want to make things too complicated, and I didn't want to introduce unnecessarily high poly counts into the model. Because keep in mind, when we export this into an STL file, it'll have to be represented as a mesh. So that kind of covers the 3D design of this model, and now we move on to the 3D printing portion of it. So the 3D print is actually running right now, and as you can see, it'll take about 21 hours to completely print. What I'm trying that I've never tried before is a somewhat new to me, but relatively old feature in Cura, which is the ability to generate tree supports. Um, and tree supports kind of look like tree branches. Let's see if I can rotate. So I believe the goal here is to make supports that are more structurally sound, easier to remove, while not compromising the integrity of the 3D print. This is the first time I've ever actually used 3D supports, tree supports, because in the past I've just used, normal supports. I've also put a support blocker, which is this kind of gray box over here, in front of the text because the tree supports were just going all over the place. And in the past, with this angle of steepness, supports aren't super necessary. I mean, you might have a little bit of sagging from these undersides over here, but other than that, the font should be legible and hopefully it looks nice. Another sort of design consideration was structural integrity. I will be removing these supports, except for the permanent ones, and when you try and remove supports, sometimes the support might also take away a part of the model itself. So you want to make sure your model is quite strong, durable, and rigid. Most people would set an infill of 100% and call it a day. But in reality, you don't really have to do that. In fact, adding more shells, not shells, what is the proper term? Walls. Adding more walls or thicker wall count can account for this. So if we go from top to bottom, you can kind of see that these spheres are almost entirely solid, especially the ones made out of the hydrogens, which I found were ones to break off quite frequently. They're considerably solid. The parts that do break as well are the bonds, but going up and down, you can see that most of these bonds are quite solid as well. Now, if we were to set the infill to 100%, this whole structure over here would be solid plastic. This bottom plate over here would be solid plastic. But all it really does is just waste tons and tons of plastic and would add considerably to build time. The only benefit is that it just feels a little bit heavier, and that weight adds to the perception of quality. Another small design consideration I've taken, and this is purely for aesthetic purposes, was adding a concentric top layer. So you can see concentric lines more or less are going to be present on the top layer. These small aberrations were largely due to the fact that I had to add these sort of manual permanent supports. So it kind of deviates from the aesthetic, but I hope it's not going to affect the print quality, and I don't really imagine it would. So, yeah, this is kind of how it looks. It can be applied for other molecules. It can also be applied for proteins. Again, it's really up to you and what you have access to and where you can find these sort of publicly available models, or rather chemical formulas and protein structures to use with the intent of 3D modeling and design. So yeah, on that note, I will switch over to hopefully a real example of this product and kind of take some notes in terms of what worked well and what didn't after this is done printing in approximately 21 hours and 36 minutes. And voila, here is the 3D printed model with the supports removed. So after having a chance to print this actually several times, I would say the main sort of block or main regret was issues with support placement. So I did opt for tree supports, which would largely support these loose hydrogen atoms and a few of those carbon atoms. as sort of removable supports in addition to the manually placed sort of fixed supports. Now, the issue here is that tree supports, while they are effective in minimizing the contact area between the print itself, with small ball-like objects, there really isn't a good solution towards supporting prints for those. So you can actually see a few of these balls, or a few of these hydrogens, were somewhat misprinted. Especially this one is probably the worst of it, right in the center. It became slightly misaligned. See, the problem with spherical objects is that there is a limited surface area for a sphere in general. Even with supports, you don't have much surface area in contact with the support itself. Now, there are z-offsets you can implement to allow even a part of the support to be physically merged with the print itself, but that'll cause challenges with removing the support. And with a model like this, even with basically 100% infill density in the balls and in the sticks themselves, these are relatively fragile. So when I was removing the supports, I basically had to use these pliers to remove just the support right below the ball, rather than trying to remove the entire support all in one go, or else there's a good chance that either the bonds would break, the balls would break, or these manual supports would break. But overall, I do recommend the Arial font. Don't remember if this was italicized or not, but it did a fairly good job. Now, of course, this isn't a top-of-the-line printer, so you are going to have some printing artifacts. This sort of blobbing discontinuity, whatever you want to call it, was probably caused by too high of a print temperature, because this is printed at a 220 degrees Celsius nozzle, 60 degrees bed. However, I opted for a higher printing temperature than average because of the fact that I wanted to ensure the layers were sufficiently adhered to one another. Because upon removing the supports, you are kind of rocking this model back and forth a little bit. And you can see it is somewhat flexible. Again, I don't want to put too much strain on it. So to kind of summarize, I would say the only thing I would have done differently is perhaps introduce more removable manual supports under specific carbons. And the tree supports worked well, and it probably took maybe 20-30 minutes to get all of them properly removed. But if I had to do it again, and if I had to redesign the model, maybe I would opt for manual support placement. That being said, there's no guarantee that my manual supports would be enough to support all the molecules themselves. And this might be an iterative process where I would basically try and manually place different supports in different positions through trial and error to figure out which one works best. But overall, I am very satisfied with the quality. There's a nice gold sheen, which actually gets more and more visible the thinner layer heights become. But for the sake of print time, this was a 0.2 millimeter layer height, printing for about 1 day, 3 hours. So again, if we were to do, say, 0.1 millimeter layer height, double time, same amount of plastic, but 2 days. The part that actually kept failing the most was right when it started printing these lower hydrogen atoms. Because of the poor surface area contact, I actually had to increase the interface density as well as the general support density overall. Because if one of these balls comes loose, it'll start rocking around throughout the print. It'll snag on the nozzle. Once it snags on the nozzle, it'll start knocking over other supports and other parts of the model, ultimately leading to a catastrophic failure. I guess if needed, or if anyone comments on this video, I'm more than happy to share print settings that I used for this particular build. And yeah, pretty cool. All right, well, I hope this was of some use to anyone. Thanks.